6 o'clock in the morning, pitch dark, 3 men asleep, one awake. The one who is awake hears it before he sees anything, a noise coming up out of the dark behind the boat that does not sound like weather. It sounds mechanical, like something enormous arriving on rails. Then the boat goes over, not heels, not rolls onto her side. Goes over, completely, 40 feet of trimaran and 6.5 tons of her, flipped through 180 degrees like a toy in a bath, and everything that was the floor is now the ceiling. The cabin is upside down and full of noise. Freezing seawater is coming in through a hatch that is now under the surface, pouring upwards into what is left of the air. Everything that was stowed, food, tools, clothing, charts, the contents of every locker, is in the water, in the dark, moving. 4 men are inside it. 3 of them have just woken up underwater, in the dark, in a space where none of the geography they went to sleep in exists anymore. Every one of them thinks the boat is sinking. It isn't. That is the first thing they get wrong, and it is the thing that saves them, because a trimaran does not sink. She has 3 hulls full of buoyancy, and she will float upside down more or less indefinitely. She has just stopped being a yacht and started being a raft. A very cold, very dark, very wet raft. They are 140 miles east of New Zealand. It is the 4th of June, 1989, and it is winter in the Southern Ocean. They will be on that hull for 119 days. The boat was called Rose Noëlle. She was a 12.5-meter trimaran, and she belonged to a New Zealander named John Glennie, who had built her himself and who had already sailed a trimaran around the Pacific with his brother back in the 60s. He was in his late 40s, and he was not a novice at anything to do with boats. On the 1st of June 1989, she left Picton at the top of New Zealand's South Island, bound for Tonga. Warm water, a long way north. It was meant to be a good trip. There were 3 other men aboard. Rick Hellriegel was 31, a former policeman who worked as an outward-bound instructor. Jim Nalepka was 38, an American, working as catering director at the same outward-bound school. Phil Hoffman was in his early 40s. Here is a detail that matters more than anything else in this story. Apart from Hellriegel and Nalepka, who knew each other through work, these men were essentially strangers. They had no shared history, no established way of dealing with each other, and, as would become extremely clear, not a great deal in common. 4 men who barely knew one another were about to be sealed into a space smaller than a garden shed for 4 months. 3 days out, the storm found them, and at 6 in the morning on the 4th of June, at roughly 40.5 degrees south, a wave came in astern. Glennie has described it as a vertical wall of water, something like 60 feet high, his estimate, from the deck at night, and I am giving it to you as his description rather than a measurement, because there was nobody out there with an instrument. Whatever its true size, it did the job. Rose Noëlle went over and stayed over. This story is unusually well documented for a survival case, because all 4 men came home and gave accounts. Glennie wrote a book and has given interviews for more than 30 years. The New Zealand press covered the aftermath exhaustively from October 1989 onward. In 1996, Television New Zealand made a documentary in which the men were interviewed directly, and it won Best Documentary at the National Television Awards, where their accounts differ from each other, and on some points they differ sharply. I will say so. The first job was to stop drowning. Inside an inverted hull, there is trapped air, and the water level inside settles somewhere. Where it settles determines whether you live. On Rose Noëlle, it settled low enough to leave a usable pocket in the after section, a wedge of space above the waterline, in what had been the stern that was now the highest point inside the boat. That wedge became the whole world. 4 men, in a space where nobody could stand, that was permanently damp, that was cold, and that had almost no light. They got the EPIRB going. An EPIRB is an emergency beacon. You switch it on, and it transmits a distress signal that satellites pick up, and that is your one link to the idea that anyone is coming. It transmitted for 9 days. On the 13th of June, its battery died, and Rose Noëlle went silent. Nobody had come. Nobody had heard it in a way that produced a search anywhere near them, and now there was nothing transmitting at all. Hold on to that, because what the authorities on shore concluded from that silence is the thing that gives this story its title, and I am not going to tell you yet. What I will tell you is that the 4 men on that hull had, at that point, no reason to believe anybody was looking. Everything from here is about systems. That is the thing people get wrong about long survival stories. They imagine heroics. What actually keeps people alive over months is boring, repetitive engineering, done badly at first and then better. Water first, because water is the clock. A person has days, not weeks. At the beginning, they were rationing whatever they could find in the flooded lockers. Glennie has described the early ration as a few ounces of soft drink a day, per man. They had kiwi fruit aboard, which they let ripen and ate partly for the vitamin C, which is not a small detail, because vitamin C deficiency over months is scurvy, and scurvy is what historically killed people in exactly this situation. The thing that turned survival from a countdown into a possibility was rain. They rigged a catchment system. Upside down, a boat has a lot of surface that funnels, and once they had worked out how to route rainwater off it and into containers, the clock stopped. They were in a latitude and a season that produces rain regularly. Once they could harvest it, water stopped being the thing that would kill them. Then food. Barnacles grow on a hull. A hull sitting upside down in the ocean for weeks becomes, from below, a floating reef. Small fish come to eat the growth. Bigger fish come to eat the small fish. Sit still in the open ocean for long enough, and the ocean builds you an ecosystem. They speared fish off the hull. Not reliably, not enough, not at first, but enough. And they built a shelter. The stern wedge got improved, insulated, closed off, made drier, made warmer. Over weeks, using whatever came to hand. That is what 4 months looks like from the inside. Not one dramatic decision, 1,000 small improvements to a bad situation, made by cold people who had nothing else to do. Which brings me to the part of this story that nobody who has not been through something like it finds easy to hear. 4 men, strangers, in a wet space where none of them could stand up, for 4 months, with almost no food, no privacy, no news, and no evidence anyone was coming. They did not become a band of brothers. There were long periods when they were trapped inside that shelter for days at a time because the weather made going out impossible. There was conflict. There were arguments about rationing, about method, about who was doing what and how. The kind of arguments that in normal life dissolve by the afternoon, and that in that space had nowhere to go and no way to end. They stayed alive anyway. And that is the actual achievement, more than the fishing or the rainwater. 4 men who did not particularly get on kept each other breathing for 119 days without anybody dying and without anybody being lost over the side. The drift, meanwhile, was doing something nobody expected. Common sense and the prevailing systems out there said they should have gone northeast, out into the empty Pacific, towards the Kermadec and away from everything. That is what the ocean does with things in that part of the world. Rose Noëlle did not go northeast. She went the other way. Slowly, invisibly, over months, an upside-down trimaran with 4 men inside her was working her way back towards New Zealand. Nobody aboard knew that with any certainty because they had no functioning navigation. What they had was a sky, an improvised means of taking a rough angle on the sun and whatever charts had survived the flooding. It was not navigation in the sense that a navigator would recognize it. It was better than nothing, and over enough weeks it started to tell them something they could scarcely believe, that they were not being carried away from land, they were being carried towards it. On shore, the assumption had gone the other way. Rose Noëlle had a last known position and a beacon that had stopped. Search and rescue had a radio message they believed placed her out near the Kermadec Islands, several hundred miles northeast of Auckland. That is where a boat in that situation should have gone. That is where they were looked for. Nothing was found because they were not there. And so, in the Water Safety Council's bulletin for August and September of 1989, the 4 crew of the Rose Noëlle were listed as drowned, not missing, drowned, in the vicinity of the Kermadec. At the moment that bulletin went to print, all 4 of them were alive, in the stern of an upturned trimaran, drinking rainwater and eating fish, drifting slowly towards the coast of New Zealand. Their families had held services. The men were, in every sense that the world recognized, dead. In late September, after nearly 4 months, they saw land. Try to sit with what that means. You have been inside a wet, dark box for 115 days. You have not seen anything but ocean since the first week of June. You are severely underweight. And out there, in the distance, there is an outline that is not water. It was Great Barrier Island, a large, rugged, thinly populated island northeast of Auckland with a steep bush-covered coast. They had no steering, no rig, and no engine. They could not sail to it. All they could do was watch it get closer and hope the wind and the sea took them onto it, rather than past it and back out into the Pacific, which would have been the cruelest possible ending and was entirely possible. On the 30th of September 1989, 119 days after she went over, Rose Noëlle came in onto the rocks at Little Waterfall Bay on the southeastern side of the island. Landfall on a rocky coast in a swell is not a relief. It is the most dangerous few minutes of the entire ordeal. The hull that had kept them alive for 4 months was now the thing being smashed against rock, with them inside it, in the dark, in surf, in a state where none of them had the strength they would have had in June. She broke up, they got out, and then they had to climb. That coast is not a beach you stroll up. It is steep, it is dense bush, and the 4 of them, after 119 days on rainwater and speared fish, had to get up it. They clawed their way through it to find help. They found a house, and then 4 men, who the New Zealand authorities had formally listed as drowned, walked in and announced that they were not. The Coast Guard's assessment afterwards was that apart from significant weight loss, they were in good physical condition. Good physical condition, after 4 months. What happened next was one of the biggest media events in New Zealand's recent history, competing television helicopters landing on the same small beach, a fight for the exclusive, a book deal signed within days. It was the story of the year. It was also, almost immediately, not entirely a story of celebration. There were questions asked about it, hard ones, official ones, and the way this country received 4 men back from the dead is not what any of them expected. But that is the next video, and it deserves its own. I want to end this one where the men are, and on the one thing John Glennie has spent the 30-odd years since saying to anyone who will listen. Rick Hellriegel, 31 years old, former policeman, outward bound instructor, the youngest of the 4, died of a brain tumor 2 years after he came ashore. He survived 119 days in the Southern Ocean, and then he had 2 years. Jim Nalepka went back to his life. Phil Hoffman went back to his. John Glennie kept sailing and kept talking about it, and eventually wrote it all down. And when people ask him what to take from it, he does not talk about the wave, or the fish, or the rainwater. He tells them to go and lie in their bunk at home and imagine the boat upside down. Where does the water in your tanks go? Will it drain out through the breathers? Are the hatches inside going to stay shut when they are on the ceiling? Is anything tied on, or is it all going to end up in the water in the dark in the first 10 seconds? And then he says, the thing that this channel has now arrived at from 2 completely different directions. Stay with the boat. The men of the 1979 Fastnet learned it at the cost of 15 lives, that while a yacht is still floating, the yacht is the life raft, and the sea takes the people who leave. John Glennie learned the same lesson from the other end, and he is here to say it out loud, because Rose Noëlle was upside down and wrecked and full of water, and she still carried 4 men 140 miles home. She did not sink. She just stopped looking like a boat. They were listed as drowned in a government bulletin in August, and at the end of September they walked up a cliff on Great Barrier Island and asked to use somebody's telephone.